Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another episode of Retro Gaming Rewind. So today we're going to be talking about Phantasy Star, and specifically Phantasy Star III. Now, what is a Phantasy Star game, you might be asking? Is it some adventure game where you go on and become a very famous pop star? No, that's not what happens in this game, although if it was made today, that probably would be a plot point. But I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, so let's talk about the often maligned, often ignored third installment in the Phantasy Star trilogy right now. While many gamers these days know Phantasy Star as an MMO of sorts, Phantasy Star actually got started out in the late 80s as a series of single-player, turn-based Japanese role-playing games for the Mark III, aka the Sega Master System, or the Mega Drive, aka the Sega Genesis. The series was always a little bit different in the fact that it was a first-party, from Sega, RPG series, which was not terribly common, and still, even today, it's not very common. Phantasy Star III was released in Japan in 1990, and then it was released in Western territories in 1991. Now, right around then, we were just stepping into the golden era of console role-playing games, and the first two Phantasy Star games had helped build the foundation for these longer adventures to be experienced on consoles. So Phantasy Star III had a lot to live up to in that respect. And that's not the only expectation that Sega had to deal with in producing this title. During this title's production, Nintendo was going into full hype mode for a little something called the Super Nintendo. It's pronounced SNES. Sega knew that they were going to have some very strong competition. And it's kind of crazy to think about now, but everyone knew back then that the Super Nintendo was going to have a power advantage over Sega's system, and Nintendo was already legendary with their first-party games. So Sega knew that they needed to deliver and show a strong lineup of games for the Mega Drive and Genesis if they wanted to survive. So at this time, a new Phantasy Star game sounded like a great fit to release in the Super Nintendo launch window to make it as difficult as possible for gamers to choose the Super Nintendo over the Genesis. It's good business, right? Yes! Well, let's take a closer look at that. The first Phantasy Star was released in 1987 in Japan and then out west in 1988. The second installment was released in March of 1989 in Japan, and then out west in March of 1990. So to this point, there was a good 2 years between releases, leaving a little bit of breathing room to develop the sequel and let anticipation grow for the next installment. However, Sega decided they needed to release Phantasy Star III in Japan of April of 1990, and then out west in July of 1991. That's only 13 months between 2 and 3 for a major first-party RPG title. This obviously gives everybody involved a lot less time to write, develop, test, and distribute the game. Another factor to consider, a lot of the key developers that made the first two games so great were being pulled from Phantasy Star to work on Sonic the Hedgehog, including the creator and master designer of the Phantasy Star series, Reiko Kodama. Now, if this sounds like a perfect storm of suck, well, you would be correct, and all those factors clearly had an impact on the quality of Phantasy Star III. But enough about the history lesson. How does the game actually play, and does it hold up? Are there any saving graces to this title? Well, sort of. So let's start out with the story and the writing. If you've ever played a JRPG where the character is washed ashore with no memory or troubled by dreams of an evil force pushing them into action, you can thank Phantasy Star for a lot of those tropes. Phantasy Star III starts with your character about to marry a completely anonymous girl who washed up on shore about 2 months ago, which is, totally normal. I must have really hit it off in the ICU. Oh. But before the marriage can actually be completed and consummated, evil forces come and whisk her away, and instead of the game just ending there and you going on to do whatever the hell you want with your life instead of marrying a complete stranger, you decide to be a hero and go save her. And that's really where our story begins. Where Phantasy Star III truly innovated was in its story. This is one of the very first console JRPGs to have multiple endings. As you progress and reach certain plot points in the game, you're forced to choose a female character to marry, and you have an offspring, and that offspring becomes your new main character and begins a new leg of the adventure. This game is the first that I'm aware of that plays with the concepts of passing along a storyline through generations, with late-stage plot twists that change your perspective on the earlier parts of the game that you've already played. While the game does start out very slowly, it eventually builds up to a solid story, and it does a decent job of developing its characters. While I only played through one of the possible storylines, the plot remains as solid as pretty much any other RPG for the most part. Now moving on to graphics. The first thing you might notice when looking at this game is that it doesn't look at all like the previous two Phantasy Star games. It has a much more medieval look to it, fitting in more with kind of classic fantasy. And to me, this is some of the most obvious evidence of a new team being involved in development. Now there is still a sci-fi thread to the world itself. I mean, there's cyborgs, and I mean a lot of cyborgs, and robots, and mostly evil ones. But the level design across the spectrum of towns to dungeons to overworlds, it's all incredibly dull, especially towns. Aside from geographical layout, there is no difference in any of the towns. It's the same with the dungeons as well. Everything is based on a simple grid pattern, so that immediately limits the possibility for these dungeons. This is where I was really missing the first-person exploration piece of Phantasy Star 1, where that grid design actually makes a lot more sense. Variety is definitely one of the game's weak points, and I feel like this has to be a function of the limited development time. Where this game does still shine graphically is just in the design of the enemy characters in battle. While there is unfortunately very little animation that takes place in the battle scenes, there are a lot of different enemies, lots of variety, and some crazy designs that are best appreciated, possibly inebriated. Like, what is this? What's happening here with this guy? Moving on to the sound and music, to me, the music is actually a really strong point for this game. While it doesn't manage to reach the ridiculously amazing heights of the Phantasy Star II soundtrack, it's still pretty damn good. I mean, this one almost sounds like it could be a melody to a lost 80s ballad. The sound effects are decent, nothing special really. If anything, I would say the sound effects might have needed a little bit more punch. They're definitely serviceable and sound even better through the Genesis stereo port. Everything sounds better through the Genesis stereo port. Okay, so let's talk gameplay. And this is where the game really starts to hurt. The gameplay, while solid at the time, it was already becoming a bit dated by the time it was released. And time has not really done this game any favors as far as gameplay. Alright, so I've got sort of a list of gameplay topics that I wanted to kind of go through for this review, because these are points that I think modern gamers should sort of keep in mind before they play. So grinding, that's just a thing in mainline Phantasy Star games, and this game is super grindy. You're just going to have to deal with it. Now the encounter rate is something to mention here. Now you can't see the enemies coming like you can on some modern RPGs. The encounters are totally random and the encounter rate is very high. Another thing to note, there's a lot of backtracking and padding of the game through overly complex level design. And as you're traversing through a lot of this backtracking and overly complex level design, you notice that your character has very slow movement. And this is in an age where characters were starting to move a little bit quicker in overhead maps. And I think at some point some of these games were offering 8-directional movement where this is still a basic 4, up, down, left, right. Now like I said earlier, there is no first-person dungeon exploration like there was in the first Phantasy Star, which I miss tremendously. Another thing too is that you're really going to want to look up a guide on the equipment in the game, because there's not a whole lot of information being presented to you in the game and in the shops about the stuff that you're buying. Another ding for the game is that there's really no complex mechanics or like complex magic system. There is magic in the game, however, you can technically, for the most part, not even use magic at all once in the game. Now fast travel, that's something that we all love, and it does actually exist in this game, however it shows up really late in the game. And the most frustrating part about it is that the cyborg who has been accompanying you through the entire journey of this game is the one that transforms into a vehicle to transport you to these other lands. Now why couldn't he do that earlier in the game? So in closing, considering the shortened development time this team had and the pressure from leadership to release a quality game, they actually did a pretty damn good job. No, it's definitely not nearly as good as some of the other RPGs from that time, but it's also not nearly as bad as some people make it out to be. Alright, so let's take a look at what you actually get when you buy the game. So here, obviously, we have this classic Sega clamshell with a whole bunch of cool stuff inside. You got the cartridge on the right. Always check that sticker, make sure it's in good shape. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff here on the left, starting with this poster that you think is going to be really cool, and it kind of is, but it's just a very basic map of the 6 overworlds that you kind of explore throughout the game. It's not detailed enough to be too helpful. So kind of cool that it's there for artwork purposes, but not very helpful. All right, now moving on, you got the instruction manual here. Pretty basic, black and white, covers the basics. Kind of cool. And then on the back, actually, there's a couple ads for some games that I actually have in my collection. And then we got the, good old poster here. I used to love getting these things in the game, these posters. I had a bunch of them. I used to basically just kind of stare at the images. And then you had Toe Jam and Earl. Very cool. They be jammin'. Used to love Toe Jam and Earl. But yeah, I would just stare at these images on the back of this thing, and just dream about owning all these games. And God, you remember $150 consoles. Imagine that. And there it is, Truxton. Great game. All right, so let's get rid of this thing. Let's put that away, and then let's take a look at what's left in the box. Not much. So you got your business reply card there, and then you got the hint book mail-in thing for $14.95. So I hope you guys learned a little bit about Phantasy Star 3 today. I certainly learned a little bit, cutting this video together. It wasn't a great game when it first came out, and it certainly doesn't hold up today against a lot of the classics that came out at the same time. However, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be, but it's certainly not a very good RPG. What I like to tell people to do is go play the game and form your own opinion. Because I know for some people, this is probably their first JRPG. So this game holds a special place in their heart, and I can totally understand that. It's definitely got a lot of the Phantasy Star DNA, a lot of the stuff that I fell in love with playing 1 and 2. So I can completely understand people really digging Part 3. So anyway, guys, go play the game yourself. Form your own opinion. I hope you have fun with it. Until next time, I'll see you later.